Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to get cleaner and sharper images in low light and using high ISOs. If you're new to this channel, my name is Simon d'Entremont. I'm a professional wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada, and I make weekly videos showing you photo tips and taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Wedding receptions, music concerts, dark gyms, indoors, shady forest environments. These are all tough environments to get nice, clean, sharp photos out of. And people who come out of these environments often find that their photos aren't sharp and they're very, very noisy. For me as a nature photographer, shooting in low light is nothing new. Wildlife is the most active early and late in the day and early morning and late evening. I shoot astrophotography as well. I'm going to share my experience and the tips and tricks I've learned over the years to help me get better photos in these scenarios. Now there's 6 variables that impact low light photography. Number 1 is the available light. That is, how much light is in the environment and available for you to capture with your camera. The biggest variable right here is indoors versus outdoors. Something that people who don't do photography don't understand is just how much more light there is outdoors than indoors. I'm going to show you a quick example here of taking a camera and going outside. I've stopped down my lens to f13 to get the ISO down to 100. Then let's see how long of exposure it takes to properly expose the photo outdoors. Then we're going to come indoors, take the same photo with the same f-stop and the same ISO and see how much time we need to gather the same amount of light. As you can see here, the exposure for indoors took 4 seconds versus the exposure for outdoors took 1/8 of a second. That means indoors requires an exposure 20 or 30 times longer than outdoors to get the same equivalent exposure. Shooting indoors then is so much more difficult than shooting outdoors when it comes to light. Even areas that look well lit indoors, like gyms with big bright lights, look well lit. But try doing fast action photography in a gym and you realize you're shooting in a dungeon. It's dark in there. So if you're in a dark environment and you can actually move your subject, look at going outdoors, for example, or if you're indoors, getting next to a window will give you a lot more available light than you have natively indoors. You can also add more extra lighting, like using flashes, LED panels, or big softbox lights. Moving outdoors from indoors obviously gives you a lot more available light, but be careful outdoors. In the full bright midday sun is usually not good for photography unless you know what you're doing and maybe shooting the shady side of your subject. Shooting the full bright sun where everything is exposed to the bright sun doesn't yield very good photos. It washes out your highlights, you lose all your color, like in this photo here. In wildlife photography, shooting under the canopy of the trees on a dark day is really dark. Here's a photo of a warbler I took at ISO 12,800. Very early morning and very late evening. Also for wildlife photographers, it gets very dark. Shooting this fox like at ISO 10,000, even with a big f4 lens, is not uncommon. The next way of getting more light is with the aperture of your lens. The f-stop represents how big the aperture is on your lens, with a smaller number meaning a bigger aperture. f2.8, for example, lets in twice as much light as f4. f4 lets in twice as much light as f5.6, f5.6 twice as much as f8. So f2.8 lets in 8 times as much light as f8. So when you're running low on light, shoot lenses that have wider apertures and open the aperture of whatever lens you're using as much as you can to take advantage of as much light as you can. On some zoom lenses, the wider aperture setting has a larger aperture than the longer focal length. For example, this lens here at 100 millimeters is f4.5, but at 400 millimeters is f5.6. One option is to shoot these lenses wider so you can take advantage of the larger apertures. So when you're shooting in very low light situations, use your lenses that have the broadest aperture available. f2.8 is often a goal for people who want to shoot indoors. Shooting wildlife before sunrise and after sunset becomes very challenging because you need a certain amount of shutter speed to freeze the moving targets. I have this lens that's f5.6 at 400 millimeters, but even that sometimes is not enough light for my action photography. For situations where the light is really low and I need a lot of focal length, I'm lucky to have this 500 millimeter f4 lens. This lens is super sharp and lets in a ton of light for capturing fast action and gathering lots of light at the same time. But some of these lens choices can get very expensive. If you're looking for a budget option, most major brands will create what people call the Nifty 50. That's a 50 millimeter f1.8 lens that lets in a reasonable amount of light and is a good flexible focal length at 50 millimeters that you can do lots of things with. Most brands make this type of lens for $200 or $300, and for some of them you can find used ones for $100. While f2.8 is an aperture people like to shoot at indoors, if you're shooting dark wedding receptions or shooting Milky Way photography, f2.8 even is sometimes not enough light. In those cases, people may go for something like a f1.4 lens, like this Sigma 20mm f1.4 lens. I use this for Milky Way photography, and when I shoot this at 1.4, I can use ISO 1600, where if I was using f2.8, I'd be using ISO 6400. The next variable we can control to letting more light is shutter speed. The slower the shutter speed, the more light that is captured in between when the shutter opens and the shutter closes. A good rule of thumb for a good shutter speed is shooting 1 over your focal length. So for this 400mm lens, 1/400th of a second. You may be able to get by at 1/50th of a second on a 50mm lens. But there's a trade-off here. You need a certain amount of shutter speed to freeze the action. If your action isn't moving, you can put your camera on a tripod and take as long a shutter speed as you'd like. But if your action is moving in low light, you need to throttle the shutter speed a little bit to slow it down, to have just enough to capture your fast action, but let in as much light as you can. And fast-moving subjects need even more shutter speed than the 1 over the focal length rule. But when the light is low, we can't always shoot the shutter speed that we'd like to. When I'm shooting fighting baby foxes, I might be shooting at 1/2000th of a second, but I can only do that if there's lots of available light. I shoot in manual with auto ISO, and if my ISO is getting up to 10,000 when I'm shooting at 1/2000th of a second, that's starting to get pretty high for my ISO, so I might lower my shutter speed to 1/500th of a second. When it gets really, really dark, I might lower it again to 1/250th of a second. When you need to get your shutter speed under the 1 over the focal length rule, there's a chance your photos might not be sharp. So you need to do whatever you can to try to stabilize your lens or try to still get sharp photos. One option is to put your camera on a tripod or a monopod. That way the lower shutter speeds have less chance of making your images blurry. But lowering your shutter speed, especially for fast action, can only be done to a certain point. In a gym, shooting sports, you might want to shoot at 1/1000th usually to freeze the action. But if there's not enough light, you might have to try to lower that to 1/640th of a second or even 1/500th of a second. The problem is not all of your photos will be tack sharp at those shutter speeds. So the trick here is to shoot as many photos as you can. If you take 10 photos in a series of someone handling the ball or capturing some action, if you can get 2 or 3 of those 10 might be as good as you can do in really low light situations. Having the best panning technique at these low shutter speeds is really important as well. I've got a whole video on shooting birds in flight and fast action and another one on taking sharp photos. If you look at those, you'll get some great techniques on how to improve the sharpness of your photos shooting action. These tips are especially important in shooting a lower light where you might not have the shutter speed that you'd like to have. Now, if you're lucky enough to have image stabilized lenses or camera bodies that have sensor stabilization, you have a huge advantage in trying to shoot very slow shutter speeds because it really improves the chance that your photos will be sharp. Now let's talk about ISO. This is going to be a bit controversial because I'm going to say some things that are going against conventional wisdom. I'll start off by saying that high ISO does not cause noisy images. ISO is basically a volume knob on your sensor, and either using different types of technologies where the sensor becomes more sensitive to light, or it's a gain knob, a volume knob that adds volume to the amount of light that you've captured so that your image gets brighter. ISO is not a source of light. It is just something that makes up for the lack of light by increasing the brightness of the photo. The only sources of light in your photo are the ambient light that comes in, having larger aperture to capture more, or having longer shutter speeds to capture more light in a longer amount of time. Your ISO is only high because those sources of light aren't able to capture enough, and the camera needs to increase the brightness of the photo in exposure to make it look appropriately bright. So when it's high, your images are noisy, but it's not the high ISO that caused the noisy images. The high ISO is the result of having a low amount of light, which causes noisy images. So how that expression goes, don't shoot the messenger. The ISO is just the messenger of the fact that you have not enough light in your photo. When your ISO is at 12,000, your camera is telling you your photo is too dark and I have to really crank it up to get the exposure right. Now, because of this view that high ISO causes noisy photos, people artificially try to keep their ISO low and hence maybe underexpose their photos thinking that's a solution. So there's not enough light, their ISO is at 3200, Their photo is still underexposed, but they don't want to raise it to 6400 because they say, well, if I raise the ISO, it'll make a noisier image. That is not the case most of the time. Depending on the camera brand and the technology used, for the most part, underexposing your photo because you don't want to raise the ISO and then raising it later in processing will actually make the problem worse, not better. Most camera brands, if you underexpose the photo and raise it later, will actually make a noisier image. You'd actually be better off making your ISO overly high and lowering it in processing. If you could do that without clipping the highlights, you'd actually get a cleaner photo most of the time. Use available light, longer shutter speeds, and larger apertures to capture more light, and hence your ISO won't need to be as high. So when people say use lower ISOs to get cleaner images, what they really mean is use the available light, wider apertures, and longer shutter speeds to get more light so that your ISO doesn't need to be as high. So if I say that high ISOs don't cause noisy images, what causes noisy images then? Noisy image is caused by what's called a poor signal to noise ratio. Even with even illumination, each of the photo sites on your sensor will not record the exact same amount of light. These little variations, once they're magnified, creates noise, inconsistencies in the photos, brighter and darker spots. When there's more light, this noise is still there, but it gets buried underneath much more available light. So here's an example of noise in a photo site. The blue dots are noise. Now the red dots, these are the available light. If you see there's only a small amount of available light, then the noise and the available light, it's hard to distinguish the two from each other and the noise is readily visible. Now let's say we take a much longer exposure and we get a lot more of the good light that we want, those red dots. If you put in a lot of red dots, that is a lot of light, you see that you swamp the blue dots and you don't see them as much. So a brighter image swamps the noise and the noise is less visible. That's why photos taken in a lot of light are less noisy than photos taken in low light. So let's talk about camera sensors. The size of the sensor and the size of the pixel can impact how well it handles low light. In general, full frame cameras like this Canon R5 will handle low light better than my 7D Mark II or this Canon M50. That's because a full frame camera not only captures a bigger field of view, but also the photo sites on the sensor of a full frame camera are larger, collecting more photons, again creating a better signal to noise ratio that I talked about earlier. This ability to capture more light means that when you raise the ISO, it does not impact the quality of the photo as much than on smaller sensor cameras. Of course, technologies and brands differ, but in general, a full frame camera will handle low light better than a crop sensor camera. A crop sensor camera may handle low light better than a micro four thirds camera, and a micro four thirds camera might handle low light better than the camera on your phone, for example. That's why for people who shoot in low light on a regular basis, like wedding photographers, Milky Way photographers, nightscape photographers, they might want to shoot with a full frame camera. But I think in general people are scared of high ISOs maybe more than they need to be. I've shot and printed photos from my 7D Mark II at ISO 6400, like this photo right here. And I printed photos at ISO 12800 or ISO 10000 with my Canon R5, like these photos right here. What's the highest ISO of a photo that you're proud of that you've ever taken? And what camera did you shoot it on? Put it in the comments below. I think people would love to know. People will also say that cameras with low megapixel counts will have better low light performance than high megapixel cameras. For example, my 20 megapixel R6 would have better low light performance than my 45 megapixel R5. My experience has not been the case. It is true that when you crop up in the images on a low megapixel camera, it looks a bit cleaner, but that's because usually you're not cropping in as much. My experience is the noise on the higher megapixel cameras is a bit finer and easier to clean up, and then when you crop the photos to equivalent size, the noise just about looks the same. So when you've done everything that you can to maximize the available light that's there, lengthen your shutter speed to capture more light, increase the aperture of your lens or use the lens you have with the largest aperture to get the most available light, once you've done all of those things and you've got an image on your sensor, what's left is processing your photo. So a few quick tips: shoot in RAW. You get the most dynamic range and the most ability to process your photo if you shoot it in RAW. First off, Don't try to raise the shadows in your dark photos. If your photo was taken of a dark scene and you shot the shadows were shot at ISO 1600, for example, if you try to raise that 3 stops in processing, it's the same thing as having shot it in ISO 12800 and probably worse because you raised it in post-processing. If your photo is dark in certain areas, try to keep it dark. If you raise the shadows, you just expose the noise that's there. So the trick in high noise images is to try to reduce the noise without reducing the detail of your subject. There's a few different techniques that you can use to do this. Noise is also more apparent in smooth areas than areas with a lot of detail. So often in the background of your photos, in the smooth background is where the noise is most apparent. There's actually 2 types of noise. One is color noise. These are red, green, and blue spots and pixels that show up in your photos that are shot in very low light. These are actually removed with a color noise reduction quite easily, usually without affecting the sharpness of your photo too much. The other type of noise is luminance noise. That's the noise from a poor signal to noise ratio and the uneven amount of light in each pixels. This can be removed with noise reduction. For example, in Lightroom has a noise reduction slider that you can slide, and when you move this noise reduction, you actually reduce the noise in the photo. But one thing that can make noise worse in your photo is actually sharpening the photos or using the clarity slider too heavy-handedly. If you add the clarity slider to a noisy image, you will actually increase the noise. Now, there's a trick in Lightroom for sharpening your photo without making the noise worse in the problem areas like the background that I mentioned that's smoother. When you're sharpening in Lightroom, hit the Alt key and use the masking slider. By properly sharpening your subject but not the background, you'll make the noise reduction much more effective in cleaning out the background but leaving your subject untouched. Another way that modern features of Lightroom have enabled are to select the subject in Lightroom, which is a new feature added in the last version, then invert the mask so that way you have the background selected and not the subject. Then apply the noise reduction to the background only. Look at how this has removed the noise in the background but not the subject where you want to preserve the detail. Then there's AI-based noise reduction tools. They're actually incredible. They're really good at picking out your subject in the areas that need to remain sharp and the areas where the noise reduction should be applied more aggressively. Here I'll show you an example of a photo that was quite noisy, and I'll show you the before and after noise reduction is applied. It'll show you that the background that was noisy has really been cleaned up, and the area where I really wanted to preserve the detail has been preserved. Another technique you can use for noisy images if your target isn't moving is to actually stack images. I do this in Milky Way photography where I'll take a dozen Milky Way photos and stack them together using software to end up with a cleaner result than I did with one exposure. And one of the easiest tips in processing to handle high noise images is don't crop. Cropping kills when it comes to noise. It really makes your noise more apparent. If you take a noisy image and crop in deep and then pull that up and make it larger, you're really just blowing up that noise. The trick with high noise images is to fill the frame as much as you can with your subject, or if your subject is small in the frame, use a composition where your subject looks small in the frame and looks nice small. For example, this photo here, I could crop in a lot more. The photo is sharp enough, but I'm just exposing the noise of the image. By keeping the frame wide and keeping the rest of the photo, not just my subject, to be part of the environment of the photo, I really mask the fact that the image is noisy and I create a nice photo at the same time. I come out with a new video about weekly. If you like this type of content, please subscribe to see more. I hope you go out the very next time and get great low light photos.